Welcome to our webinar series, One Question. Basically, this is a series of webinars where we get fireside chat executive conversations tackling one specific issue, and that is how we're shaping the investment intelligence today. And each time we take a different topic, but ultimately call for action to the listeners on the webinar. I'm Lorenzo Saa, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Clarity AI, and today we're going to cover part two of our AI and data quality series. This is really looking at, during the reporting season, which in many countries we're in, how as disclosure surges, we're actually finding what need to collect and use data that is both, on the one side, essential for the decision making, but quite often overwhelming. So the goal is to see how to achieve and drive data accuracy, defensibility, and trust, while leveraging in a responsible fashion on AI. So I encourage you before or after this webinar to actually make sure that you have taken a look at part one. This is our first session, which looked at how to build the right AI data infrastructure with my colleague, Borja Cadenado. It actually is an excellent conversation that looks at how we can scale efficiently the investment decision-making process while ensuring that we're maintaining flexibility to integrating new elements that include data, frameworks, and proprietary insights. My colleagues are now probably sharing the link of the webinar, so you will be able to track that and ensure that you have it to go to it after you've listened to today's episode. Now, part two today is all about the adoption challenge. And in fact, yes, we've seen that there's a growing sense of increase of AI capabilities, but does that convert in real world day-to-day adoption? And I think the answer is often it isn't. And this is specifically the case in finance, where there's high stakes, and ultimately these challenges do not really come typically from technological limitations, but by structural aspects, by the need to verify the data, to integrate in your workflows, which is often underestimated. And then ultimately, these are things that often the regulator are calling on. So are we accountable to that regulation? All of this I would call in one word, the need for trust. So today we will explore how actually AI is creating value and seeing where instead friction still limits adoption. And this is really for all those practitioners out there that are trying to take on the reality of AI while being sustainable investments. So I'm excited to bring my second guest today and colleague, Austin Ritzel. He's the AI strategy manager at Clarity AI. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and it's a pleasure to be with you and everyone in the audience today.
Fantastic. And look, as we said, these are only simple one question. So the question to you, Austin, is, are we using AI for the right tasks? So let's just jump right in. The first thing is, as we said last time with Borja, we know that we have the need for this right data infrastructure. But even if we get there, if and how are the end users actually using AI into day-to-day workflows?
Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo. So it's a great question. So the adoption is clearly happening. We conducted a survey at Clarity AI late last year, and our own survey data shows that nearly 58% of financial market participants are either already using AI today as part of their financial use cases, or they're planning to use it in the next year. And the top use case, by the way, parenthetically, is sustainability data processing. So both the appetite and the use cases are very, very real. That said, there is a practical challenge that I'm seeing teams confront as part of their adoption journey, and that is really fundamental. It's about developing a clear framework for where and how to use AI. So the most sophisticated firms are building out these frameworks before they go on the vendor shopping sprees and start throwing AI anything and everything. And the dominant adoption framework approach that I've seen from such teams is really centered around the idea of triaging tasks by what I'd call the cost of being wrong. And to be clear, I think that this task triage around the cost of being wrong can be applied just as well in personal use cases as to professional use cases. So I think that this is an idea that should guide us, whether we're talking about AI for sustainability research or for risk monitoring, or using AI to file your taxes, right? Which is an entirely different subject, but the cost of being wrong is a really important thing to have in mind. So um, there are three task categories that I think these firms are, again, the most sophisticated firms are triaging around. The first is what we would call low stakes, high volume. So here these firms tend to let general AI run. So they throw Claude and ChatGPT and Gemini at problems like drafting internal emails, summarizing meeting notes, brainstorming, restructuring a messy deck. Basically, if the output is 80% right, they can fix that final 20% in a reasonable amount of time. The second task category would be something like medium stakes analytical tasks. So good example might be in the world of finance, a corporate investment banking unit synthesizing the implications of a 200-page EU regulatory proposal for a client. So here they might still be using general purpose AI tools to do some of that heavy lifting, but they're still subjecting the AI's outputs to pretty significant rounds of human scrutiny and edits. The key discipline here would be treating AI output as a draft, never as a final deliverable off the shelf. Finally, and I think this is probably the most relevant set of tasks, there's high stakes decision grade tasks. So these are tasks that demand specialized tools only. So extracting specific emissions figures to feed a portfolio risk model, or engage directly with a company, mapping disclosures against regulatory schemes like SFDR and so on, really producing anything that's going to be audited or presented to a client or regulator. Every number in these scenarios must be defensible, must be traceable, must be auditable. And this is generally where general purpose tools start to break down. Quick,
But oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead, Lorenzo.
No, I just thinking in finance,
Mhm.
and in sometimes regulated finance, there's this concern between the efficiency and the risk. In these three buckets, is there only one that you can take on in financial analysis, or do you feel that there is some flexibility in taking this on, and how?
So I do indeed think there's flexibility, and we may cover this later, but I do not think that general purpose AI is fundamentally incompatible with regulated financial analysis. I think there are some important nuances, but generally something like general purpose AI, so your off-the-shelf Claude or ChatGPT, is going to be mismatched for the highest stakes tasks. So I would say, for the first task category, the low stakes, high volume work, also the medium stakes analytical tasks, there's room there for general purpose models, certainly in the first task category, no doubt. When you're talking about data extracting data from reports, so specialized data that requires nuanced sustainability insights, or you are generating a report altogether that will face client scrutiny. Those scenarios, you're going to need a specialized tool, because we'll talk about this throughout the session, I'm sure. The general models are not going to give you the precision, nor most critically the information on data provenance that you'll need to confidently defend those outputs to a regulator or to a client. And I think um, there, proxy season actually offers us with a nice example of how these different bundles of tasks and associated tools work together. Um, so we can think about again proxy season being the season when practitioners are absolutely slammed with hundreds of disclosures in a very short time frame. A practitioner in this scenario during this time frame might use general AI to triage which reports have material updates worth reading. That's low stakes sorting, right? That can be done by an off-the-shelf general purpose tool. They would then use a specialized tool like those offered by Clarity AI, specifically data extraction technology, to pull the actual metrics with purpose-built models and auditable citations. That's high-stakes data. They might then leverage Gen AI report generation, also something that Clarity AI offers, to help draft the narrative for their portfolio manager. That's medium stakes writing. So there you have three tasks, three levels of AI trust,
Yep,
one workflow.
that's that's fantastic. Thanks. I mean, these high stakes financial analysis, there seems to be a tension between efficiency and risks.
Yeah.
Um, you published a really interesting article recently around the concept of verification tax.
Mhm.
How do you see that dynamic, and what does this verification tax actually mean?
Yep. Yep. Really, really good question. So I think we need to be very cognizant, and again, this is something that everyone should think about both in their personal use of AI and certainly in their professional use of AI. We need to be cognizant about the point of transition, the liminal space between efficiency and risk, or in fact waste. Efficiency turns into to risk and waste the moment that the time you spend verifying AI outputs exceeds the time that AI saved you. And you mentioned, Lorenzo, that I wrote about this concept to some length in an article published a few weeks ago. It's something that I call the verification tax. Others call it the validation debt, and those with a fondness for rhymes call it the verification obligation. But no matter what you call it, it is the silent killer of AI return on investment in high stakes industry like medicine, law, and yes, certainly finance. To make it very, very concrete, we can imagine a scenario in which an analyst is tasked with scanning a company's full suite of corporate disclosures to build a sustainability risk profile. They use a general purpose LLM like Claude or ChatGPT, Gemini, and a 3 hour task is done in 30 minutes. Fantastic. It looks like a huge win. But when that analyst begins reviewing the outputs of that model, they'll notice some suspicious figures. So they might notice that the company is withdrawing a volume of water equivalent to Lake Superior. That's an example I gave in the article because it is in fact not just a salient and grabby example. It is in fact a real one. Um, it the analyst might also notice that the company's scope 2 emissions are higher than the total output of Germany. Again, this is something that we've seen these general purpose LLMs actually do. They will realize upon review that of course something is not right. So they spend the next 4 hours trying to understand where the AI got those numbers, and getting there is a very, very arduous process, right? It means reverse engineering obscure logic and tracing inconsistent citations and source links. And by the way, that only accounts for the data that is clearly wrong, right? We can talk a bit later about what happens with the data that is wrong but seems plausible. So there's a clear difference between what's again obviously wrong and what can get by your human review. So basically, the math is simple with this scenario that I've just laid out. The task itself takes 3 hours without AI. With general purpose AI, it takes half an hour of generation plus 4 hours of verification. That's 4.5 hours total. So that efficiency gain, as you would have expected, is actually an increase in time spent. That's the verification tax, right? You've actually gone and wasted time as a result of using AI. And I would argue that this is not a one-off. This is again fundamentally an outcome of applying general purpose tools to specialized high stakes problems. And the architecture of these models makes it such, right? These models are trained on a massive but chaotic mix of Reddit threads, opinion pieces, Wikipedia articles, outdated filings. They're just simply not designed for environments where every number, every insight must be fundamentally defensible and traceable. And the final thing I would add on this point is actually there's some interesting data released by Anthropic last week. They actually engaged in what they're calling the largest qualitative study in history, and probably is. They surveyed about 81,000 people via Claude, so 81,000 users of Claude about what they want from AI. And basically, the results confirm a really substantial tension between AI's decision-making benefits and unreliability concerns amongst professionals in high stakes fields like the three I mentioned before, so law, finance, and medicine, where
Yep.
specialized data is super central. And interestingly, these practitioners note both the highest rate of increased efficiency in decision-making processes and the highest rate of unreliability incidents. So that fact check tax or validation verification tax is really, really a bottleneck to the AI return on investment, as I said.
So it's interesting. When I thought of verification tax, I would think more around efficiency, but there's
Hmm.
something there around trust, clearly.
Yeah.
And so, is there, given that this is a regulated financial analysis market, is
Hmm.
there basically a point where these general purpose AI are just fundamentally incompatible? And is there a way to bridge that gap? Is RAG, which you maybe can explain to
Hmm.
us, going to be the solution? And if so, how from an AI perspective?
Yep. Um, so if I think again, I would nuance the idea that general purpose AI is fundamentally incompatible with regulated or high stakes work like financial analysis or investment. Um, I don't think it's incompatible everywhere. I do think again it's mismatched for the highest stakes
Yeah.
tasks, and that distinction really matters. So general purpose AI is phenomenal for a huge range of work. I use it every day. I know that you make use of it as well, Lorenzo, but the incompatibility arises when the output feeds directly into regulated decisions. So compliance artifacts, client-facing analysis as well, where every number again must be defensible. And you mentioned the idea of RAG. That really brings us to one of the core issues with applying general purpose models to special purpose use cases, and that is data diet. So general large language models are, as I've said a bit earlier, trained on an ocean of very broad information. Um, some of that information is excellent, some is terrible. That's the nature of human produced content. Um, so asking a general large language model to deliver a company's board composition data is akin to like trawling the ocean for one specific breed of fish rather than searching in a curated aquarium. That the trawling approach occasionally delivers the right answer is incidental. It's not a reliable outcome. And Clarity AI's approach is, I think, pretty instructive here. Um, For example, our analyst co-pilot operates in what we call a clean room environment, and this gets back to the RAG architecture. So RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. The technicalities of RAG are not strictly important to this conversation, but suffice it to say that RAG adds context to the prompt that you provide the LLM or the model. That context is unseen by you, the user, but in fact dictates the corpus of data that the model will be leveraging to produce its output. So in our architecture, the model only has access, the copilot only has access to corporate disclosures, validated data, and our methodologies. And that restricted, specialized architecture means that while it cannot give you a recipe for Sunday dinner, it's also far less susceptible to hallucinations or low quality data contamination.
Great. I guess thralling is not good for AI as much as this is not good also for
Exactly. Yes,
sustainability.
indeed.
Um, Look, if I'm okay, I'm an investor, right? And
Yep.
I'm looking at, how to evaluate an AI tool,
Yeah.
knowing that it also has a regulatory component to it. What should I be looking for?
Um, it's a really, really excellent question, and one that I think that practitioners are beginning to put more focus on as they really focused on the ROI of these tools. I think there are at least three non-negotiable requirements. If a tool doesn't meet all three, I do believe that investors and financial market participants more broadly should walk away and look elsewhere. The first is specialized constrained data outputs. We just talked about this in regards to the Clarity AI's RAG architecture, for example. So ask the vendor what data does this model have access to, and what explicitly does it not have access to? That is equally important. You want a clean room, not the open internet. So the quality of the input determines the reality of the output. This is that classic garbage in, garbage out axiom. The second non-negotiable is source transparency and auditability. So every claim, every data point, every metric should come with a direct one-click link to the source and an explanation of how the value was derived. It shouldn't be just page 47. That's not enough anymore. You need to understand every link in the reasoning chain. That's the difference between a black box that you're never going to be able to understand and never defend in front of a regulator or client, and a glass box that you will be able to understand and defend against stakeholders. The third um, is a bit more nuanced, but it's the ability to say, I don't know. This is a
Mhm.
characteristic that we've long valued in humans. I think the same should be true for our alien AI coworkers. Most general purpose AI is optimized to always produce plausible sounding answers, even when it shouldn't. A model built for regulated workflows must be able to admit its own fallibility, and those cases in which it encounters uncertainty. We talked about this before. I think it bears repeating here. A visible gap in your data is a problem that you can solve. A gap that has been silently filled with a confident sounding hallucination is a problem that you don't even know exists. The price of the first is just time. Price of the second is at a minimum trust, which is a much rarer commodity, and for investors can result in very real regulatory or returns-based consequences. The bonus criterion, and I won't spend too much time here because Borja, I believe, covered it in his session, is model agnostic architecture. So, the pace of AI development is absolutely staggering. Um, every release of a new model from OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, even DeepSeek, is really resetting which model is most appropriate for which task. So as a consequence, you need a tool that can integrate new models in days, not quarters, so that you're never stuck on yesterday's technologies, yesterday's costs, yesterday's performative issues, and worried that the competitors are constantly pulling ahead.
Fantastic. I got my notes. So if I were to summarize, it's have an AI clean data room,
Yep.
make sure the source and transparency and audibility is there, and ultimately be able to say, I don't know. And
Yes.
on top of all that, this model agnostic element, which I think is fantastic. So as an investor, as we start closing, if they have one question they should ask themselves before applying an AI to a task, what should that question be?
I think it's actually quite simple. The question is, if the output is wrong, would I know, and what would it cost me? Um, I think that single question forces you to think about the stakes before you think about the speed. If the answer is I'd catch it quickly and the cost is low, use whatever tool is fastest, cheapest. General purpose AI is fine there. But this is not usually the case for specialized high stakes workflows, as we've discussed. This is why companies like Clarity and Harvey and Tempest and more exist. For these types of workflows, the answer is more frequently, I might not catch it, and the consequences could be severe. The loss of a client, compliance risk, material misstatements, a missed investment opportunity, et cetera. So in this case, again, you need a tool that has all of those criteria that we just mentioned. It's transparent, it's specialized, it's traceable. You can review its outputs quickly and eliminate the verification tax. And this single question is essentially just the triage framework that I established at the start, distilled into a single question. So it's again about avoiding paying the verification tax by matching the level of AI rigor to the level of stakes before you press enter on your keyboard.
Fantastic. Look, Austin, we're out of time. I found this extremely interesting, and I really want to thank you for sharing all your insights.
Oh, my pleasure, and thank you, Lorenzo, and all those in the audience.
Yeah, look, I think as I was one of them in the audience, I can say that this triage model really helps, I think, look at how the market will probably split, right? We'll have those that end up being the victims of the verification tax and those firms that instead move to demanding proof over the promise of AI. And so I see this kind of as moving, from moving fast and kind of breaking things that it seems what's going on in the market right now to moving smart, but to building things and ultimately drive that level of trust. So thanks, everyone. Look, my colleagues are now going to be sharing a set of related links. First of all, the previous webinar that we had, which is again was around build the right AI data infrastructure. I really encourage you to take a look at it. Austin's article on the real return on investment challenge of AI in finance, and really you'll highlight accuracy, trust, and the verification tax. And if you're interested, please do leverage on our demo request form that you'll be seeing in the notes. I do hope you enjoyed the session today as much as I have. Thank you for joining, and see you soon on the next One Question webinar.